GST registration. Let us discuss about GST registration. What is registration in general terms? The action or process of registering or of being registered is registration. Registration of any business entity under GST law implies obtaining a unique number from concerned tax authorities for the purpose of collecting tax on behalf of the government. When registered, you will get a unique number. First two digits are state code and followed by PAN number, and other things will follow. That is a identification for the registration. To whom it is applicable? To everybody registration is applicable? No, some registration, some person's registration applicable, some person's registration not applicable. We'll discuss. Every supplier of goods or services, every supplier of goods and services is required to obtain a registration when in the state or union territory from where he makes a taxable supply, once his aggregate turnover exceeds the threshold limit during financial year. That means he has to register in a state or union territory from where he makes a taxable supply, provided his aggregate turnover exceeds the threshold limit during financial year. It is not previous year. In the current year itself, if your turnover exceeds a certain limit, then you have to go for registration. Then we will discuss what is aggregate turnover, what is threshold limit, and everything in further slides. Why registration is required? Registration is the most fundamental requirement for identification of taxpayers, ensuring tax compliance in the economy. It is a identification for a supplier. Without registration, a person can neither collect tax from his customer nor claim any input tax credit of tax paid by him. He cannot collect tax, he cannot charge the tax in his invoice, or he cannot adjust the input tax credit against his supplies. Registration ensures the seamless flow of input tax credit from supplier to recipient at the national level. It is very important because this is the major reason for the government to implement GST, the seamless flow of input tax credit at the national level. Earlier, it was not possible because of so many deficiencies in the indirect tax regime. Now, all these things removed and GST implemented. Under GST law, a supplier is required to obtain state-wise registration. There is no concept of a centralized registration under GST like the erstwhile service tax regime. A supplier has to obtain registration in every state or union territory from where he makes a taxable supply, provided his aggregate turnover exceeds a specified threshold limit. To go for registration, his taxable turnover should exceed certain limit, and that should be taxable supply. Otherwise, there is no question of registration. Thus, he is not required to obtain registration from a state or a union territory from where he makes a non-taxable supply. If he is dealing in non-taxable supply, registration not required. Another thing, statewide registration, it is not a centralized registration. It is not like one registration for one country. No. In each state where you are making taxable supplies, you have to go for registration. Now, when the person becomes liable for registration, the person becomes liable for registration when his aggregate turnover exceeds a threshold limit during a financial year. That means in the year, for example, this year, if your aggregate turnover exceeds certain limit, then you have to go for registration. You need not wait for a year to end. You have to go for registration. When the aggregate turnover exceeds a threshold limit. What is aggregate turnover? Aggregate turnover includes value of all outward supplies. What contains outward supply? Outward supply means, in simple terms, it is sale. Sale includes taxable supplies, exempted supplies, exports, interstate supplies of a person having same PAN to be computed on all India basis. This turnover will be computed on all India basis on the basis of PAN. And you remember the contents of supply: taxable supplies, exempt supplies, export supplies, interstate supplies, everything included in the aggregate turnover. But excludes taxes. That is CGST, SGST, UTGST, IGST, cess, and value of inward supplies on which a tax is payable under reverse charge, RCM. That what is RCM we will discuss. The taxes are excluded, and the turnover where the person paying tax on reverse charge has to be excluded. All other sales to be included in computing the aggregate turnover. Just for our understanding, what is RCM? Usually, a supplier of service will collect tax and deposit the same to government treasury. Usually, supplier of service, provider of service will collect and deposit tax, just like a person who sells goods have to collect tax. A supplier of service will collect tax and deposit the same to the government treasury, usually. But in some cases, recipient or buyer, the person who avails the service, has to pay the tax on service availed by him. This is called RCM. Normally, supplier of service has to pay, but in this case, the recipient of service, buyer of service, have to pay the tax on the services availed by him. This is called RCM. Example: Raman Private Limited pays GST on sitting fees paid to its director for the services rendered by them under reverse charge. Here, Raman Private Limited is the person. Raman Service Private Limited is the entity receives the service, recipient of service, and the provider of service is a director. They are getting the sitting fees because they are providing services. That is why the company pays the sitting fees. In normal scenario, director have to pay the tax, but in this case, director will not pay the tax. The Raman Private Limited has to pay the tax. The value of services provided by the director to Raman Private Limited will form part of aggregate turnover of director and not Raman Private Limited. This turnover should not be added to the aggregate turnover. Hope you understood. Next, what is threshold limit? What is threshold limit? I will segregate the threshold limit into two categories for the understanding purpose. Otherwise, the confusion arises. That is why. The threshold limit for both goods and services. Assume a person dealing in both goods and he also provides services. It's a one category. Another category, the threshold limit exclusively engaged in supply of goods, is only supplying goods, not dealing in any services. These are two categories. First category deals in both goods and services. For Mizoram, Manipur, Nagaland, Tripura, these are the special category states. I will call it as MMNT shortly. MMNT. If their taxable turnover, aggregate turnover aggregate turnover, not taxable turnover, aggregate turnover exceeds 10 lakhs, then they have to go for registration. Means a special category states their turnover exceeds 10 lakh, then they have to go for registration. For all other states, the threshold limit is 20 lakhs. Remember, this is for the entity or person who deals both goods and services. 20 lakhs for special category states and other states, it's 20 lakhs for other states and 10 lakhs for the special category states. If a person with the place of business in different states across India has one branch in special category states, MMNT, the threshold limit for GST registration will be reduced to 10 lakhs. For example, if he has a registration in other states like Karnataka, Gujarat, Maharashtra and other states, and he also have turnover in Mizoram or Nagaland, assume, then his threshold limit reduced to 10 lakhs instead of 20 lakhs. Now, the threshold limit exclusively engaged in supply of goods. You should remember one notification number 10/2019. Wherever you go, it will follow. As per notification number 10/2019, dated 7/3/2019, any person who is engaged in exclusive supply of goods, any person who is engaged in exclusive supply of goods, not service, and whose aggregate turnover in the financial year does not exceed 40 lakhs. He should deal exclusively in supply of goods and his turnover should not exceed 40 lakhs, then he is exempt from registration requirement. As per notification number 10/2019, is a turnover limit enhanced to 40 lakhs for registration. The condition is he should exclusively engage in supply of goods and aggregate turnover in the financial year should not exceed 40 lakhs, then he is exempt from registration. I will quote this notification number 10/2019 in all other slides also. It is required actually. Some exceptions are there for this notification. It is not applicable to all. Taxable supplies. A person is required to obtain registration with respect to his each place of business in India from where a taxable supply has taken place. However, a supplier is not liable to obtain registration in a state or union territory from where he makes an exempt or non-taxable supply. I will take the example. It will clearly reveals what is the situation of taxable supply, non-taxable supply, exempted supply, everything. Uday Enterprises is engaged in supply of taxable goods in Maharashtra. Uday Enterprises is engaged in supply of taxable goods in Maharashtra. It also supplies alcoholic liquor for human consumption from Nagaland. Nagaland situated in special category states, and alcoholic liquor comes under exclusions. It is exempt supply. These three things you should understood, and you should go understood carefully. One is a taxable supplies he is making in Maharashtra, and another alcoholic liquor exempted supplies makes in Nagaland. Nagaland is a special category state. Turnover in Maharashtra is 34 lakhs. Turnover in Nagaland 8 lakhs. Turnover in Maharashtra 34 lakh, that is a taxable supply. Turnover in Nagaland 8 lakhs, that is a non-taxable supply. That is alcoholic liquor. Total turnover 42 lakh, including 42 lakhs. Since Uday Enterprise is exclusively engaged in making taxable supplies of goods from Maharashtra, the applicable threshold limit for obtaining registration is 40 lakh. However, the threshold limit will not be reduced to 10 lakh in this case, as the supply of alcoholic liquor for human consumption from Nagaland are non-taxable supplies. Here, that non-taxable supplies, alcoholic liquor, that's 8 lakh turnover, whether it should be added to taxable turnover or not, that question arises. But you should go to aggregate concept of or definition of aggregate turnover. Aggregate turnover includes taxable supplies, exempt supplies also. You already studied. That is why you have to add this exempted supply also to the taxable supply. Then the total turnover would be 42 lakhs. Then he is liable, he exceeds the threshold limit of 40 lakhs. That's why he is supposed to register in Maharashtra. Whether he has to register in Nagaland? No, because the answer is simple. He is dealing in exempted supply. If it is exempted supply, non-taxable supply, then registration is not required. In the given case, since the aggregate turnover of Uday Enterprises exceeds the applicable threshold limit of 40 lakhs, is liable to obtain registration. It will obtain registration in Maharashtra, but is not required to obtain registration in Nagaland, as he is not making any taxable supplies from said state. Now, exceptions to the notification number 10 2019. I told you it is a very important notification and some exceptions also there for this notification. You should carefully go through the exceptions also. First one, a person required to take compulsory registration under section 24. Under section 24 of the CGST Act, certain persons have to register mandatorily. For those persons or entities, that notification number 10 2019 not applicable. Those persons, section 20, what is it? Section 24 we will discuss. Second one, persons engaged in making supplies of ice cream and other edible ice, whether or not containing coca, pan masala and all goods of chapter 24, that is tobacco and manufactured tobacco substitutes. For this registration, that means registration is mandatory. Notification number 10 2019 not applicable. The tobacco, manufactured tobacco, substitutes, etc. Third one, persons engaged in making intrastate or interstate supplies in a state of Arunachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Meghalaya, Sikkim, Telangana, Puducherry and special category states as per section 22, that is MMNT, Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura. For those states, this notification is not applicable. What are those? Arunachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Meghalaya, Sikkim, Telangana, Puducherry and special category states of Mizoram, Manipur, Nagaland, Tripura. This notification not applicable. Next, interstate supplies of goods are nevertheless liable to compulsory registration and are already covered in exception A above. Interstate supplies. The person who making interstate supplies is required to register under GST. It is mandatory. That is why this notification is not applicable to interstate supplies. Last one. Persons who has opted for voluntary registration or such registered persons who intend to continue with their registration under CGST Act. If a person wants to register voluntarily, irrespective of his turnover, then he can register. Then this notification is not applicable. These are all the exceptions to the notification number 10 2019. Exemptions. Specified category of persons notified by the government exempted from obtaining registration. So specified category, government only exempted from obtaining registration. The persons making only reverse charge supplies, that comes under RCM, already discussed. The person making only reverse charge supplies, they are exempted from obtaining registration. Second one, persons making interstate supplies of taxable services up to 20 lakhs. This is very, very, very important. The person making interstate supplies of taxable services. Normally what happens when the interstate supplies means supplies outside the state, the registration is mandatory. But in this case, if a person engaged in taxable services, supply of taxable services, and he is making taxable services, interstate taxable services also, up to 20 lakh, he is not required to register. That means a person who is engaged in taxable services can make interstate supplies up to 20 lakh. It is only applicable for the services. Third one, persons making interstate taxable supplies of notified handicraft goods. Persons making interstate taxable supplies of notified handicraft goods up to 20 lakh. A person engaged in notified handicraft goods can supply interstate also up to 20 lakh. Up to 20 lakh he can supply interstate also. He need not register up to 20 lakh. His threshold limit will be 20 lakhs. Casual taxable person, CTP, making interstate taxable supplies of notified handicraft goods up to 20 lakh. Casual taxable person is mandatory requirement for registration. We'll discuss later. If he supplies to notified handicraft goods up to 20 lakh, registration is not required. This is another exemption. What is exclusive supply? Exclusive supply. We'll take a discuss examples also so that we can understand the exclusive supply. For the purpose of section 22 subsection 1 of CGST Act 2017, a person shall be considered to be engaged exclusively in supply of goods even if he is engaged in exempt supply of services provided by way of extending deposits, loans, advances for the consideration is represented by way of interest or discount. That means a person exclusively engaged in supply of goods and he is also providing services. What services? Exempted services like extending deposits, loans, advances, etc. and collecting interest. This is exempted supply. Even though he is dealing in exempted supply and he is dealing in supply of goods, then exempted supply will not be a hurdle for computing the exclusive supply. That means he is considered as exclusively engaged in the supply of goods. Hope you understood. We'll go further. Briefly, we will discuss about the advantages. He is legally recognized as a supplier of goods or services or both. A person, if he is registered, he will be recognized legally as a supplier of goods and services or both. He is legally authorized to collect tax from his customer and pass on the credit of tax paid on the goods or services supplied to the purchaser, recipient. When a person engaged in supply of goods, he has to give invoice. He has to charge GST in the invoice. A person who is registered, then only he can charge GST and he can take the input credit on his procurements. Seamless flow of input tax credit from supplier to recipient at the national level. This is important, already told. The main intention of government is to flow this input credit at the national level. Earlier, indirect tax regime not provided this benefit, means the flow of input credit not seamless at a national level. The GST overcome this difficulty. Registered person is eligible to apply government bids or contracts or assignments. Means to apply for the bids, government bids, all those things, the registration is mandatory usually. Registered person under GST can easily gain trust from customer. Whether the multiple registration is possible. Usually one registration for one state or PAN. One registration for one state. Exceptions of one registration for one state. Multiple registrations permitted for separate business vertical. One as an input service distributor and other for outward supply. Example. Apple manufactures computers, tablets, phones, headphones, music player, and so on. Management at Apple can divide the overall company performance into smaller segments based on these products to measure where the company is succeeding. They want to know what is the sales of computers this year, what is the sales of phones, what is the margin of headphones, all those things. The separate segments, segment revenue and segment profitability they want to know. In that case, they can take multiple registration in the same state. Otherwise, there is a one registration for one state. Some persons are not liable for registration. We will discuss the same. Section 23, subsection 1, subclause A. Section 23, subsection 1, subclause A. Any person engaged exclusively in the business of supplying goods or services or both, they are not liable to tax. They are not liable to tax or wholly exempt from tax under CGST or AGST. If a person or goods is not liable to tax or goods wholly exempt from tax, then registration is not required. Section 23, subsection 1, subclause B, an agriculturist to the extent of supply of produce out of cultivation of land. This registration not applicable to an agriculturist. Section 23, subsection 2, the government may, on the recommendations of council, can notify any other person not liable for registration. That means one agriculturist exempted and another one, if it's an exempt supply, for example, you are dealing in a alcoholic liquor for human consumption, then registration is not required. Again, notification number 10, 2019. The compulsory, we discussed already. Notification number 10, 2019 says prescribes threshold limit of 40 lakhs for the person who engaged exclusively in the supply of goods. Some exceptions are there. We already discussed. Under that exception, section 24 also comes. Now, what are those exceptions? We will discuss the section 24 now. The following categories of persons shall be required to be registered under GST. Persons making an interstate supply of goods. Persons interstate supply of goods, when interstate supply happens, registration is mandatory. That means for the person who makes interstate supply, that notification number 10, 2019 not applicable. Casual taxable persons making taxable supply, CTP. Who is CTP? We will discuss. Casual taxable person making taxable supply, registration is mandatory for CTPs. Persons who are required to pay tax under reverse charge. The person who is availing services and how to pay tax under RCM. RCM we have already discussed. That person have to register mandatorily. That means that notification number 10, 2019 not applicable to this person. The person who are required to pay tax under section 9, subsection 5 of CGST. That means ECO, Electronic Commerce Operator. Its registration is mandatory. Non-resident taxable person making taxable supply. Non-resident means we will discuss along with the casual taxable person. Non-taxable person making taxable supply, registration is mandatory. The person who are required to deduct tax under section 51. Normally, government agencies, government companies, organizations have to deduct certain percentage, normally it is 1%, sometimes 2% on the procurements. At the time of making payment, they have to deduct TDS, it's a GST TDS. They have to register mandatorily. That is why that section 10 2019 not applicable. Persons who are required to deduct tax under section 51 whether or not appropriately registered under this act. Persons who makes a taxable supply of goods or services or both on behalf of other taxable persons, whether as an agent or otherwise. It is a relationship of principal and agent. The principal supplies the goods, agent collects the goods from the principal on behalf of the, he sells the goods on behalf of the principal, but he has to register mandatorily. Input Service Distributor ISD, whether or not separately registered under CGST, ISD also comes under mandatory registration. Persons who supply goods or services or both other than supplies specified under section 9 subsection 5 through such electronic commerce operator who is required to collect tax at source under section 52. That means ECO, electronic commerce operator, is for operator registration is mandatory. The person who sells the goods through ECO, they also liable for registration, mandatory registration. Every person supplying online information and database access or retrieval services, OIDAR services, from the place outside India to a person in India other than a registered person. Registration is mandatory, OIDAR services. Such other person or class of persons as may be notified by the government as on the recommendations of the GST Council. All these persons comes under section 24. Since they comes under 24, they are excluded from the notification number 10 2019. We will discuss about casual taxable persons and non-residents. Under the GST, both persons have almost the same status. There may be a case where a person has a registered business in some state in India. A person has a registered business place in some state in India but wants to effect supplies from some other state in which he does not have any fixed place of business. For registration, there should be some fixed place of business. We have to give the proof of fixed place of business, PAN and other things for the registration. Here, a person has a registered business in some state. He is registered in some state, he has a fixed place of business, but wants to effect supplies from other state where he don't have any fixed place of business. Sometimes what happens, we have some business occasionally in some other states. There's no permanent business there. That is why we don't want to have a fixed place of business there. That is why such persons needs to register in the state from where he seeks to supply as a casual taxable person. He can register as a casual taxable person. Example. We will take one example so that we can understood better. Krishnadev and company engaged in supplying taxable goods is registered in Rajasthan. Krishnadev and company engaged in supplying taxable goods registered in Rajasthan. It wishes to participate in a business exhibition being held in Delhi. They have registration in Rajasthan. They are the taxable suppliers. They have a fixed place of business in Rajasthan. But they wish to participate in the business exhibition being held in Delhi. There they don't have a fixed place of business, no registration. However, it does not have any fixed place of business in Delhi. In this case, Krishnadev and company can has to obtain registration as a CTP in Delhi. They can register as a CTP in Delhi. Now, non-resident taxable persons. A person who is a foreigner and occasionally wants to effect a taxable supplies from any states in India needs a GST registration for the same. A person who is a foreigner and occasionally wants to effect a taxable supplies from any state in India, he has to register under GST. Such persons needs to register in the state from where he seeks to supply as a non-resident taxable person. Here both casual taxable person and non-residents, no option to them to go under composition levy. He cannot exercise the option to pay tax under composition levy. We already discussed in the earlier presentation what is composition scheme. It is applicable to small businessmen. That is not applicable. They cannot opt that option composition levy for pay tax. From this I covered almost all fields in the registration. If something remains, some important topics or important contents, then I will upload separate slides for the same. Hope you understood all these things. My name is Ramachandra and my email ID and mobile numbers also mentioned in the initial slides. You can contact me for any clarification. And I request you to subscribe my channel. Thank you.